Hey guys, you ready for 1.5? This is the last section before the cell theory skills test. So to get started for today, you're going to go to topic 1. We are in 1.5, the origin of cells. So today we really get to talk about how life actually started on this planet. Now, if you had me freshman year, we talked about this already, but we're going to go in a little more detail this time. So just so that we're clear, the essential idea for today: there is an unbroken chain of life from the first cells on Earth to all cells and organisms alive today. So, now there are theories that life may have arisen on this planet multiple times, and that's totally plausible. In fact, it's pretty probable. However, we know that since the last advent of life on this planet, it's been continuous, right? So the last time it happened, it was successful and it's stuck. So you're going to be making sure that you satisfy these objectives in your notes for today. Okay, as always, they'll be on the slides. There's not a whole lot today. So just so that we're clear, these are your understanding, skills, and applications. And when you're taking notes, you should be able to answer these things. So let's get started. Okay. So understanding number 1. Cells can only be formed by division of pre-existing cells, meaning cells don't just magically appear. They can only come from other cells. And we call that cell theory. That's one of the major components of what we call cell theory. There's actually 3. So the first one says that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. It doesn't matter if you're a bacteria, if you're a fungus, plant, animal, whatever. If you are a living organism, if you are a biological entity or a biological organism, you are made out of cells. 2, the cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3, cells arise from pre-existing cells. Another word for this is biogenesis, which literally means life comes from life. Bio means life, and genesis means to create, right? Bio, life, genesis, create. Life creates life. However, back in the early days, Earth's you can tell I'm stuck in my house and I don't talk to people a lot because I keep screwing up my words. Earth was pretty harsh. There was nothing around. The oxygen levels in the atmosphere were pretty much zero. It was a very reductive atmosphere. So we know that the very first cells must have emerged from non-living materials under primitive Earth-like conditions, right? So I just got done saying that all cells come from pre-existing cells, but that leaves the question, well, where did the first cell come from? And so let's just get this out of the way right now. You can say God if you want. I'm not saying you are incorrect. That is above my pay grade. In fact, I kind of get annoyed when people feel like religion and science aren't compatible. They answer different questions, right? So science seeks to answer how things happen. Religion seeks to answer why things happen, right? So God said, "Let there be light," and there was the Big Bang. So they're not compatible. If you ask any scientist as a scientist if God exists, what does he have to say? As a scientist has to say they don't know because you can't prove it one way or another. Personally, where do I fall? I'm kind of agnostic. I mean, I'm smart enough to know that there are a lot of things out there that we don't understand, right? And I'll just leave it at that. So, back to 1.5, SL Bio. We know that the very first cell that gave rise to the life that you see on our planet today had to come from somewhere, right? And that somewhere had to have been non-living materials under pretty primitive Earth-like conditions because we have fossil life going back quite a long ways. So let's move on to application number 1, because, this is science. So how did we come to the idea that spontaneous generation was not a thing, right? Life doesn't just poof appear. Well, that was Pasteur. So if you've ever had like little milk containers, right? Pasteurized milk, that's from Louis Pasteur. He is the scientist that came up with the process of pasteurization. Well, we call it pasteurization after him. So, and this really wasn't that long ago, like considering like long term, 1800s, that's like 200 years ago. So, legit, up until like 200 years ago, we thought life just like poof, it appeared. We thought if you left rotting meat out, that flies would appear on it. They would spontaneously appear. Maggots would spontaneously appear. So, Pasteur's like, yeah, I don't really think that's what's going on. So, he designed a set of experiments that demonstrated that spontaneous generation, spontaneous meaning randomly, that life doesn't just randomly appear. Okay? And we're going to go through that experiment. So Pasteur set up 2 swan-necked flasks. So a swan-necked flask is a glass flask, and it's got a long glass tube up on top. Okay? So in the first one, he filled it with broth, and he boiled it. And the reason he boiled it is because boiling it kills any organisms that might be in there, bacteria. This long neck, and because of the shape, it prevented particles from floating in, right? So he basically sterilized this flask and then he let it sit. Now he did the same thing to the second flask. However, he broke the neck, which then exposed the sterilized broth to the air. The neck was broken, it allowed air free flowing in, which brought along particles with it. After some time, he noticed that the unbroken flask, there was no growth. And that makes sense because he sterilized the broth and then nothing came in, so it stayed sterilized. However, the flask with the broken neck, he saw microbial growth. And that makes sense because air brought in bacterial, probably some fungal spores, and you got some microbial growth grown in there. So from this, he observed that growth wasn't spontaneous. Because if spontaneous generation was a thing, right? If life just magically appeared places, then it would magically appear in here too. But it didn't. It only appeared in the flask that was open to the air, which means those living cells came from other living cells, right? If spontaneous generation was a thing, we would have seen growth in that flask, but we didn't. So that was the first rigorous and controlled experiment that demonstrated spontaneous generation is not a real thing. So when we talk about cell theory, cells arise from pre-existing cells. This is because of Pasteur's experiment. Now, I did just get done saying that the first cells must have emerged from non-living materials under primitive Earth conditions, right? I did say that. So if we know that currently all cells arise from pre-existing cells, we're going to have to address the idea of where the first cells came from, and we'll do that in a few minutes. In fact, we're going to do it right now. So the first cells must have arisen from non-living materials. And the Center for Chemical Evolution is a pretty good group. They do a good job of explaining this simply. So for now, because remember, this is a video, so you can pause it and replay it as many times as you want. The first time you watch this video, I just want you to listen. I don't want you to write anything down, okay? And then you can go back and listen to it again and write stuff down. This is understanding number 2. The first cells must have arisen from non-living material.
Stated Clearly presents, Can Science Explain the Origin of Life? A full scientific explanation for the origin of life does not currently exist, but research groups around the globe are tackling the mystery. Here we'll take a look at a few of their discoveries. Darwin's theory of biological evolution tells us that all life on Earth may have originated from a single, relatively simple reproducing creature living in the distant past. This idea is based on many observations, one of which is that when living things reproduce, children are often born with random new traits. Those with negative new traits are less likely to survive and reproduce. Those with positive new traits are more likely to survive and pass those traits on to their children. Over multiple generations, positive traits build up, allowing relatively simple life forms to evolve into complex life forms and even split into multiple different species. A careful look at the fossil record overwhelmingly confirms Darwin's theory. Life forms get simpler and simpler as we go back in time. The record suggests that all life on Earth emerged from primitive cellular colonies, which first appeared roughly 3.5 billion years ago. But how did those first reproducing creatures come about? Even the simplest bacteria alive today are far too complex to have popped into existence in a single step. Furthermore, the first reproducing creature could not have developed through biological evolution because biological evolution requires reproduction in order to work. The origin of life needs its own explanation. The most promising idea right now, the one which is consistently leading scientists to new discoveries, is the idea that life emerged from chemistry. Chemistry is the study of matter, particularly how atoms interact and combine to form molecules, and how those molecules interact and combine to form larger systems and structures. Everything is made of chemicals. The air we breathe, the ground we walk on, the shoes on our feet, even the feet inside our shoes. That said, the chemistry of life is special in two very important ways. First, the chemistry of life is organized into metabolic pathways. If you look at the cells of any living thing, even a plant which you wouldn't normally think of as being very lively, you discover a world of activity. Chemical reactions occur in continuous orderly paths, each reaction sparking the next. Scientists call these strange reactions metabolic pathways. The second oddity of life's chemistry is that living cells are made of special molecules. Building blocks like amino acids and sugars, which we once thought could not be found outside of life. These building blocks combine to form highly complex and orderly structures like genes, proteins, and cell membranes. In the past, scientists had no idea what powered the strange activities of life and produced its unique chemicals. They concluded that life must be fueled by a mysterious energy they called the vital force. In 1828, a chemist by the name of Frederick Wöhler accidentally produced urea in his lab. Urea is one of the main components of urine, one of many chemicals that the scientists of his time thought could only be produced by the vital force acting inside of a living creature. The artificial production of urea suggested that life might not be powered by a mysterious force, but instead is powered by normal chemical reactions which could be studied and understood. Since that time, numerous molecules and cellular activities have been recreated in the lab, clearly demonstrating that life is powered by normal chemical reactions and suggesting that life may have emerged from non-living chemistry. Researchers have recently discovered that many of the building blocks of life, amino acids and sugars, exist inside of meteorites, rocks which have fallen to the Earth from outer space. This tells us that these special molecules are being produced spontaneously all throughout our solar system and may have been common on the ancient Earth. We've also discovered a process now referred to as chemical evolution. When simple molecules are left alone with an energy source, they interact with one another, often forming larger, more complex molecules as time goes on. Experiments in the lab have shown that chains of chemical reactions can develop, some of which resemble the metabolic pathways of life. Surprisingly, we've also found that certain molecules have the remarkable ability to self-assemble into complex, orderly structures. Some self-assemble into hollow spheres, almost identical to the membranes of modern living cells. Others self-assemble into long columns, remarkably similar to the strands of DNA found in life. Scientists still have many questions to answer about life's origins. How did different types of molecules first start working together, eventually producing the genetic code? What were the original reproducing creatures actually like? Were they similar to the cells we have today, or were they something much simpler? And finally, possibly the most interesting question of all, how likely is it that life has formed or is forming in other regions of our galaxy? So, back to the original question, can science explain the origin of life? Science has not explained the origin of life in full detail, but researchers are building a theory intended to one day describe, start to finish, how basic chemistry can give rise to living cells. I'm John Perry, and that's the origin of life, as we understand it so far, stated clearly.
Okay, so the takeaways from that are that the chemicals and the molecules that are used to build life can self organize outside of living things. So it's possible that the self organization and chemical evolution of those molecules presented conditions that were right for life to begin. So let's talk about those ingredients for life. The reason that we started with topic 2, which were macromolecules, instead of topic 1, was so that you would be familiar with these when we got to this point. For me, it makes sense to start small and get bigger, right? So remember, an organic molecule is something that is produced by a living thing and it contains carbon. And by now, you should be pretty familiar with the 4 major categories of macromolecules, right? Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And if you need a reminder, Cho, Chan,